in dementia, where even in the late stage dementia, where it is whether people are going to wander or fight off their nursing care, or they're going to slip into a routine that makes them lovable, right? Because they're regulated. We may not have affected the course of the disease, but we've affected the course of the life.
The Neurofeed podcast, how are lives being transformed at the intersection of therapy, neuroscience, and technology. Our guest today is Sebern Fisher, MA-BCN. Sebern maintains a part-time private practice in Northampton, Massachusetts, focused on the treatment of adults suffering in the aftermath of neglect and assault in childhood. She trains and consults both nationally and internationally in the use of neurofeedback in the treatment of developmental trauma, on the central role of fear in those who have suffered these devastating histories, and on the integration of psychotherapy and neurofeedback.
And that's on the individual basis, right? And the basis of a family. It's absolutely required. It's very rare, but it's absolutely required. And then you just move it up from there to climate change, right?
Yeah.
And it's all based on regulation. Every single step in that process is based on self-regulation. And I think, people can reject that view, so that I will talk about attachment, for instance, as absolutely attachment rupture is the rupture with the earth. And people take it as a metaphor, but I take it as just a foundational fact.
Yeah.
There's no incentive to turn against the earth if you're connected to it. There's no incentive to turn against the mother if there's connection there. It's just the way we are built. We are built to live in these potential harmonies, and that doesn't happen. I think you look deeply comes from attachment rupture, not from political systems, not from philosophies, not from psychology even, but from this sort of fundamental understanding of the need for human attachment and without that, we don't get through, we're at odds for the rest of our lives. We're in the worst, in the most personal worst situations, we're at odds with our own bodies. Right? How can we be part of addressing this fundamental rupture in an individual, and then let the individuals who get regulated take it from there? Right?
Yeah. Thank you, Sebern, for taking the time this morning. It's really great. I wonder, I guess, what I'd like to talk about today, really, we haven't had a sort of a basic interview in a while. And I wonder if we could start with some just basics. Like, people in the EEGer community know your story, and you've told it so many times that you're probably tired of telling it. But I wonder if you could give the Cliff Notes version, just the basic thing of how did you begin finding out about neurofeedback? And maybe a way to make this more interesting is when you began doing therapy and doing work on yourself, did you begin with an understanding that there is this, neurophysiological basis for how trauma affects us? And maybe you could describe how that whole process happened for us.
Neurophysiological, I don't think anybody had that thought. This was a creation of mind. These disturbances were disturbances of mind, and how they came about in some way related to history that I knew. And, you know, if I had thought about it deeply, I probably would have, I could have come up with a distillation of regulation, self-regulation. But instead, what you go to is, what do these pharmaceuticals do? You bypass the idea of self-regulation completely and medicate a disease. And there's no disease and there's no medication for the disease, ultimately. And that's what I would learn in sort of the hard way in working with kids in residential treatment who were considered the most disturbed children in Massachusetts. We would try everything that we had available to us, which was psychotherapy, and really devoted psychotherapy. We saw our kids 3 times a week, 2 or 3 times a week, typically. Residential treatment, they got relatively decent food. We had some attention to those kinds of things. We had a very good psychiatrist who would always do an EEG, but then I never knew what happened. He wanted to see if the brain was dysregulated, but that was only to serve medication, which you could have gotten without putting people through the 24-hour. He kept people awake, right, to see the dysfunction in the EEG. But then it wasn't that he would then rely or begin with anti-epileptics with the idea that you would get off, but where this brain is or is not. I mean, some of these kids' brains look fine, right? They weren't fine, but their brains look fine. So, but that they would just be on medications, on these toxic, often brutal medications for the rest of their lives, or as long as they were in residential treatment, and it could be enforced, because most people go off of their medications because they're so toxic. So really, that was the frame that I had. It was the frame then, even as the clinical director of this residential program, that I was bucking against. But I didn't really have I had nothing on offer for them, right? I looked at different approaches to psychotherapy. I looked at attachment focused psychotherapy. I looked at dialectical behavior therapy. I knew Marcia well, and so I was in sort of at the ground with dialectical behavior therapy, which is now pretty much the standard treatment for in the cognitive behavioral realm for trauma, which, as you know, is my developmental trauma, which is never really identified. Marcia really never identifies trauma, or I mean, she talks about invalidation, but she does not really talk about attachment and attachment. She stayed away from this. Our whole story is about that, but it's not necessary here. But and if you don't recognize that attachment rupture is the foundational problem, I don't know where you're beginning. I don't know what idea you're beginning with. So, and that has implications for the way the brain regulates itself, since the first regulator is the mother or father, but the mother the most, the mother in her body, the mother in a supported environment, the mother who gets enough so that she can take care of her child, the mother who has nurtured herself and can carry on that gift. That's not so common, as we know, right? So, you know, so we've drifted a good deal from, in mainstream therapies, we've drifted a great deal away from, or for a while were anyway, from the understanding of attachment, connection, and then attachment of the infant to the mother. And possibly the reason we drifted away from that is because there was no way to address it. Once that dysregulated nervous system was out of the home into the school or into the courts or into the, gangs or wherever they would end up, the drug, getting drugs to just manage the sheer pain of all this. Once they were out into those systems, they were just identified as mentally ill and they were given drugs. So, it wasn't that it was a feeling you could ever really address the root cause, even if you knew the root cause. So let's not know the root cause. There are a lot of imperatives to not know that, including the importance of the mother and the fear of mother blaming. Both of those come into that. Now, let's not go there. But I think one of the things that I learned when I sort of stumbled into neurofeedback, because I did not go to a course and learn about this the way I hope people are doing now, was that this could be addressed. The ravages of early developmental trauma, which now more and more people are recognizing is attachment rupture at its core, and leaves a very dysregulated brain in its wake. Ruth Lanius is doing the most profound research in this area. Once you see, you look at that brain, we can actually help that brain learn to regulate. And I learned that through my own experience with neurofeedback. Not even optimal neurofeedback by a long shot when I first did it. And now, since then, it was in the mid-1970s, 1990s, I have been exploring how to do it better. Been in conversations with people, including you, and how can we do this better? So, I don't know that.
And the just to reference sort of how you ended up to the idea of attachment rupture, which eventually became this understanding of, attachment shock and all of that, going to the brainstem eventually. But the beginning part of that, is that from Alan Shore and Ainsworth? Is that sort of the reading in those areas what led to it? Because I just talked to Ed Hamlin, he was talking about how the behaviorists really had a grip on the way that people were, the narrative about what was wrong with, what mental health issues really were. And I'm just curious, like, what in your process of like, this doesn't really, it's what it sounds like to me, maybe I'm wrong about this, it sounds like to me like you started with an instinctive response to, okay, this way of doing things doesn't feel right. And then how did that, I'm just wondering, how did you develop that other sense?
Well, I happened to do a workshop with a very controversial man, not so controversial yet, but became sort of controversial, a psychiatrist named Foster Cline. And he presented the outcomes of the antisocial or the sociopathic outcomes of failed attachment. And it just really made sense to me. And he was a proponent of holding therapy. This is why it got to be controversial. And we were having, we could contain kids more or less within the residential treatment system, but these are kids who were born in a car, taken away by social services. Family members who were in jail, long histories everywhere around them of abuse and being terribly abused themselves, and homeless and motherless, and it's like, really, what are we going to do with insight orient? You could have some sympathy for people saying address their behaviors, because if you want to get these kids so that they can just go to a job and not take up the time, room, money, and the hope, and ensure the hopelessness of the mental health community, you would have to, how can they straighten up their behaviors? Marcia, at one point when we were talking at the beginning of my interest in neurofeedback and my own experience with it, she said to me, and I think this is a pretty exact quote, she said, well, I hope that it's better than DBT. We can shape up their behaviors, but we don't get to their abiding misery. Okay. So she knew. She was aware. And anyone who's really attuned to people who are suffering at these levels, the depth that people suffer, who don't have these connections to a family, the orphans among us, even the in-home orphans, right? If you're attuned to that, you know that the therapies that we're working with, any of them, just as therapies with maybe a couple of exceptions, but psychodynamic therapies, psychoanalytic therapies, behavior therapies, one will have more appeal than the other to me or to anybody else. They'll have more appeal, but we have to look at the fact that they are not doing the trick. And so what we did was we looked back at all of we look right at the kids we were training, and we say, okay, first we had to look at them differently, and then we started to assess for attachment breaks. We hadn't even looked at that. We didn't have that as part of our intake. When we did, and we looked back at the kids who had the profound attachment ruptures had the worst outcomes. And they needed something different. They didn't thrive on Prozac, and they didn't do well with behavioral therapies. So in that breach, we looked for would holding therapies do something. And I think we didn't use them a lot, but we use them a little bit. And I think that an experience that the kid could have of being that deeply contained and cared for at the same moment in time, of a contained nervous system, I think gave them a taste of this. But the moment that was over, they were back in the misunderstood. They didn't have much understanding inside themselves because they didn't have brains that could organize an understanding. They were then back in the same behaviors of acting out. All the acting, for most of these kids, the acting out was in an effort to get held. And we would notice that. We would notice that the kids who avoided, because holding was necessary when you're working with very disturbed kids in an open setting, you have to endorse holding. And we had a holding protocol, and we were covered for all that. But that the kids who managed not to get held were the ones who went out and created havoc afterwards. They didn't have that striving. They didn't want that human connection. But these other kids wanted it, and they would go for it in whatever way they could get it, or their nervous systems would drive them toward getting it. So when we looked at outcome data for kids who were aloof and stayed out of trouble in a certain way. One of them comes to mind in particular, a boy who was my patient actually, and who got out of this residential treatment fairly quickly because he didn't cause any trouble. And I said, this is the most dangerous kid I've ever treated. Don't let him out. What was the alternative? They were going to keep him for the rest of his life. And he went out and he he contracted AIDS, and he gave AIDS to every single woman he could give it to. And that, yeah. So the whole field is up against this. We can't be superior to the concerns of the field because we know something about the brain, but we can invite people into an understanding that I fell into just by chance. It's like, I was a friend of mine wanted me to try it out for her, and I was completely skeptical, but I did. I tried it, and then oh, I noticed, oh, this fear that I live with all the time, this ambient background fear. Oh, there's not so much of it, right? It's like, if that were the only thing that we got from neurofeedback, that is a gold mine, right? That's a platinum mine, right? It's a lithium mine. I don't know what the what's the most precious metal these days, but I think that's a pretty sure bet with most people that we can get there. So yeah, that gives you a little bit of the background. So then Shore comes along and writes this massive amount of, brilliant synthetic view. But Bessel was also coming along with, I mean, he was at a talk. I was new neurofeedback. There was 600 people in the auditorium at Harvard. And he gets up at a conference on attachment, which they didn't expect to have very many people at. This was in the early 90s, mid 90s, because I knew neurofeedback already. And Bessel gets up and says, if anyone out there knows how to regulate affect, they have the keys to the kingdom. And of course, I sat on my hands. But I did have the keys to the kingdom. And we do have the keys to the kingdom, which is regulation of affect. And it is the failure of the regulation of affect that it becomes mental illness that is the primary failure of attachment rupture. When attachment rupture occurs, that's what happens. Is you don't have any capacity to regulate yourself. Sheer will, sheer conformity, determination to stay out of mental institutions or jail or whatever, but inside of yourself, not much capacity to regulate feelings, and that's what we all need on a daily basis, every one of us.
That's really great. And what's interesting to me is that when you had this experience, this initial experience with neurofeedback, you still kept the attachment bond as a primary thing. Many people get into neurofeedback and they're like, oh yeah, this is great. It really has a wonderful effect. And they don't maintain that sense that the essential part, which I've heard you talk about before, is actually the attachment bond. It's the relationship that is the key thing. That's what keeps us healthy. So what do you think, like, what's your idea of, like, why'd you do it like that? Why did you decide that attachment was still central, even though neurofeedback was making that possible, was making that affect regulation possible?
I don't think it was any brilliant stroke on my part, Lars. I think it had to do with the fact that my relationships got better and that felt good, right? I saw other people, they started to see me differently. I was more approachable, all of these things that are pretty much on a subtle level. I mean, I wasn't an outrageous or difficult person, right? But I had a personality. As one colleague of mine and friend said, if you have a personality, you have a personality disorder. And it's sort of like that in Buddhism. That's the way they would think, right? So and it gets in the way, and you feed it and you need it, and you stroke it and dream it and all. But it just seemed to be self-fulfilling or self-regulating. The regulation didn't come from the machine. It came from the machine giving me the capacity to regulate in relationships, right? The system of neurofeedback, which people do. I think you're right, that they extract it from the nexus of relationship. And to me, that's all that neurofeedback is about, is that it serves our ability to relate to one another. And it's not something that you'd ever want to remove from that central understanding. But if you look at mental illness as discrete from relationships and affect regulation as something other than those things, those primary necessities of our humanness, well, then you could go there, right? And you know, people make claims or get in trouble for making claims that neurofeedback treats all of these DSM disorders. Well, if you believe that DSM has any validity whatsoever, and we know we can touch almost all of those things, but we don't look at that as a common fact. We don't look at a common factor. We look at all of these as discrete mental illnesses. Well, we're making a big claim. But if we say we can regulate this central nervous system, and that will help in all of these problems that the central nervous system manifests in its each individual unique way, well, then that's not such a big claim. But we hardly get there. And then the critics just, you know, I mean, the criticism just rains down on, do you hear how many things she's saying she can affect? Oh, it's migraine and bipolar illness and attachment disorder and ADD, and it's a charlatan. This has got to be a charlatan. Unless you rethink this and you think clearly about what gives rise to the vast majority of the dilemmas that we think of in mental health, which is self-regulation, even in Asperger's, even in dementia, where even in the late stage dementia, where it is whether people are going to wander or fight off their nursing care, or they're going to slip into a routine that makes them lovable, right? Because they're regulated. We may not have affected the course of the disease, but we've affected the course of the life. So from the very beginning, and treating babies with attachment ruptures, or working with babies, but you can absolutely do that, all the way to the end of life, just to help people live sweeter lives, you know, more connected, and right. So, you know.
So in the time that you've been doing this work, there's simultaneously been this increasing amount of neuroscience research, particularly Ruth Lanius, other people as well, that are really sort of illuminating the parts of the brain, the networks, the different areas of it. And that, in my sense, that isn't how neurofeedback clinicians, like EEGer clinicians, started out. I wonder if you can talk about, was that part of when Sue and Siegfried were doing these trainings in the early days, was there any sense of like what parts of the brain you're affecting, or any of that, did they have a sense of that there are different areas of the brain that are affected by this process?
At the beginning, I don't think so. The ruling paradigm, and it's still, I think, the most important one, is arousal. Mm-hmm. and I think that as trauma clinicians, anyway, we really want to endorse and embrace the arousal model and find out how we quiet a nervous system. But so this was in the 96 that I met them, and so in 97, and I was focusing on fear almost entirely, and how could I quiet fear? And the field itself was pretty much focusing on attention deficit. But one of two things happened fairly quickly. One was that we could get a much wider possibility. So we were only allowed 12 to 15 hertz and 15 to 18 hertz, and there were 3 sites, and that was it, right? And you had to accomplish everything on that basis. But pretty soon, really at Sue's lead, this is Sue Othmer we're talking about. At Sue's lead, we I started placing the electrodes at different areas of the brain to see what would happen. And sure enough, when you put the sensors at these different places in the brain, you reach different capacities. And possibly people in the brain map arena, which I didn't enter into, still haven't really, we're looking at different parts of the brain to see if it could correct abnormalities in the way these brains fired compared to norms. There's difficulties with that I don't think it's important to go into now. But my approach has always been arousal, and then where this arousal difficulty manifests for an individual with this history, and then how would we think about that protocol, right? And so we're still in that conversation. Where can we most help the brain dysregulated almost from birth, or maybe even in utero, right, to organize itself? Where's the best place, at least in theory, to begin with an individual, and then let the individual brain tell us what it needs that's different from the theory, which it always does. I mean, if it only would just, I don't know, cooperate, right? But brains just do what they need to do, and you have to be in conversation with that brain to find out what's the most useful to it.
Yeah, one of the things that I love about your mentoring sessions is the way that the conversations happen. And I just recall, early on hearing you say when somebody would come with a case presentation, case study that they had questions about something they weren't really sure what was going, and your initial response was always, well, what are you thinking? So putting it back into the frame of the person who's doing the work to try to tease out what is the narrative that they have going on, what is the process. And I wonder if you could talk about how did you get to that kind of sense of like, we are exploring this area, we don't know the answers, right? But it's important to have an idea, have a question, right, and figure that. So I wonder if you can talk about how did you begin, because I don't know a lot of folks who regularly reflect back on that idea and encourage other people to be okay with the ambiguity, with their own ignorance, to own it, to be clear about it.
Well, if you're not humble before the brain, there's no hope for you, right? So if you don't feel humility in this process, then I think you should get out of it, right? And that's we just have to be in conversation with the brain. And when I'm working with people who are new to this or who are stumped in a process, that's the only avenue we have, is to have this conversation really with the brain, to get through any dogmatic barriers that there are to us really listening to what this brain is trying to tell us. And that's a profound process, and that's, I appreciate you recognizing that that's a lot of what I want to teach, because there is no, I said in the book, there is no developmental trauma, and no one recognizes neurofeedback. Other than that, this is a very salient book, a book on neurofeedback and developmental trauma. Okay? So we start at knowing very little about an individual brain. And the problem with a lot of people who use brain maps is that they listen to the algorithm and how this brain differs from normal over listening to the patient and how the patient responds. And then can say, and hopefully not many do, but can say, well, your brain can't train because it hasn't fit the algorithm. Now, most of the people with developmental trauma who get to neurofeedback are hopeless to begin with. We add the last thing, which we say, your brain can't do this. I wouldn't say that until I had tried every possible route I could think of with neurofeedback, and had this profound conversation. So I want to know when practitioners talk to me, I want to know how they've been thinking about this, and often it's a clue to the dilemma in front of us. And it's staying agile. You know, I have a friend who just learned recently that I'm writing a memoir, and he said he was a clinician with me, and I supervised him many years ago. So he sent me this little story about a kid who he brought into supervision. He said just highly unlikable, and he was embarrassed to tell me that he didn't like her, and I said, and he said, and my response, apparently, I don't remember this, but apparently was, well, then our treatment is to make her likable. And it was such a relief to him and so memorable to him, because it had nothing to do with the formula. It was just a direct response to what we were seeing. And we knew what we had to do, right? She was stay an outcast. As it turns out, this was a girl who had, had all of the trials of all the kids and had epilepsy on top of it. We could have helped her, but we couldn't have helped her then, right? Because we didn't know yet about neurofeedback, but we could have helped her. So she was being thrown around by her brain, and the chances of helping her learn social norms in the process of being in residential care and unliked and, wildly dysregulated. I was like, was asking too much, but it's the same thrust of the way that I've always thought about, quote, mental illness, is, what's right in front of us that, I have one patient who I thought, who would never look and interact with me, and, nobody had any empathy for her whatsoever, also a residential patient. So one day I had just gotten a puppy, and I brought in my puppy. And my puppy, of course, launched onto this girl who wouldn't get out of bed. And from then on, this girl was relating to me, right? That's not in the book. That's not being taught, right? And that's what every clinician, really particularly every good trauma clinician is engaged in, is that kind of active conversation with what's in front of them. And the brain is never going to yield its mystery. So, we're going to stay humble with that and just stay in conversation as best we can.
So recently, in the last few years, many clinicians, including yourself, have begun looking more at what used to be called the reptilian brain, right? The what used to be thought of, like after Paul MacLean, right? The idea that this was the earliest part of our evolution. I wonder if you could talk about how does that change, let's if you had a time machine and you were to go back 20 years and talk to yourself and say, there is some stuff happening here on the brainstem level, and this is going to be very useful. What would that conversation be like? What were the things that were just missing back then?
It's so interesting, Lars. I'm writing a memoir, and in this memoir, I am 20 years back. And guess what I'm writing about? Mostly from the perspective of body work. It's the brainstem. And I just look at it and I say, where was I? Why was I not thinking that this was a problem for me in my non-body, in my psyche, not just in body work, where they kept finding the brainstem and the brainstem's reactivity over and over and over again. But I didn't have the matrix. So the conversation wasn't there for me to enter. And so it stayed in the realm of knowing it was important, but not knowing anything more to do about that, except figuring out whether we might place an electrode at the back of the brain. And that didn't come from my own experience, except sort of incidentally. It came from reading a paper, a chapter written by Marty Teicher and Carl Anderson in one of Ruth's books, her first book. And what they were looking at was abnormal blood flow at the vermis, too much blood flow, of course, in the vermis in women who had been sexually abused as children. So I wanted to see whether we could train the vermis, right? So I found it in an anatomy book, and I put an electrode there, and oh, this had an effect. That's how that originally came about. But I was thinking it was the cerebellum. It could still be the cerebellum, you know. I don't know. Well, we put the electrode back there at about the Indian Ridge, and I've had a lot of support from EEGer, who stays with me and puts these sites up because they're not on any brain map. I appreciate that a lot. And then so the information was there. This is so common, right, for all of us, but anyway, it happened for me. And then about so I would have intimations, or my body would say it was the brainstem. My body workers would talk about the brainstem, but I didn't have a psychic manifestation of the brainstem, because you kind of don't, typically. So then about 4 years ago, right before the pandemic, that's the only time frame anybody has anymore. Was it before, during, or there's no, I don't know if the after has happened yet, but we do talk about it as after. So the Ruth Lanius says there's this very interesting new therapy that I want you to, would you like to come and meet this person whose name is Frank Corrigan? I said, really, deep brain reorienting without neurofeedback? Can't be. Can't be. Even I'm saying this to Ruth Lanius, top researcher in the field of, I didn't say it to her. I just said, no, I can't go, because I mean, my schedule was tight. But I didn't. I gave up an opportunity to go to London, Ontario, and meet Frank Corrigan 4 years ago, or 5 years ago. Well, I remedied that 2 years ago, and started working with Frank, and that is a therapy that, well, there is a story here. Do we have time for this little story?
Yeah, we do.
Okay, so 2016 was a historic election, and that threw me in a way that with Weinstein and Epstein and Kavanaugh and a few other insults to decency and thoughtfulness, but to have these kinds of psyches in control, I think, was just terrifying at some level to my traumatized core that had been very quieted and had organized around my own nervous system organizing, so that I wasn't living in the thrall of this regularly. But suddenly, this preposterous election, and you're seeing it all over the world. It wasn't just here, but here was important very directly to us and to the rest of the world. So anyway, I started to be concerned. I started to question Well, clearly psychotherapy wasn't going to correct this deep thing that's going on inside of me. Neurofeedback, although I did use it, and it was very helpful in stabilizing my response, I still had to deal with the fact that I'd had the response. Something was still happening in my being, okay, that I still had a vulnerability to this consequence that many people felt very disturbed by this election. That was sort of regular. People could feel very frightened by it. That was sort of regular. There's nothing pathological about this. But I ended up sort of back in certain syndromes that I wasn't happy with, and I had very little control over. So then I hear Corrigan, and I hear his theory, Frank Corrigan, the author of Deep Brain Reorienting. And what he is saying is that with attachment shock, attachment rupture, failure of attachment, but attachment shock, when the baby turns to the mother or the child to the mother, and there's, instead of being met, is rejected or turned away from, or whatever awful thing happens, and then, and in my case, subsequent abuse to this, there is a register of attachment shock in the brainstem. Oh, that's what these body workers were talking. They didn't have that language either, right? But that's what they were talking about. And that's what kept reverberating through my nervous system. And I was taking care of it through the body work and through quieting my reactivity with neurofeedback, but I wasn't freeing myself of the shock. And that is what captured me about Frank's work and what I've become, you know, I'm devoted to bringing these two therapies together because they belong together, and they belong, and we'll develop theory that makes it clear that they belong together theoretically, but in terms of clinical practice, they are wed. They are, neurofeedback and DBR need to belong together, which makes it a much more demanding therapy for a therapist to learn, but a much more successful therapy than either one of them alone. And, you know, I had some of my colleagues, you know, who were very devoted to neurofeedback and don't want neurofeedback to get lost in the mix. And they're getting nervous when I started talking so much about DBR. And I said, well, you know, first of all, my main reason for being enthusiastic about neurofeedback and writing a book about it is that it really helps people dramatically with developmental trauma. But I said, you know, if I could, eating gravel pellets would help, you know, trauma survivors heal, then I would be out on the circuit talking about that, because that's what this is about. It's not about being a neurofeedback person. It's about being somebody who wants to help people who have been through these terrifically awful childhoods. And but they needn't have been worried, because neurofeedback is essential. I couldn't have done DBR in the original shape that I was in when I entered therapy and started neurofeedback. There's no chance that would have been. And I think Frank recognizes that too. I know he does. I mean, it's not like we're in opposition here. We are meeting together relatively regularly to figure out how we bring these two therapies together. This is better.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, it's kind of a big topic and maybe more than we can get into, but what in your, you know, how do they work together? How does neurofeedback and DBR, why is it that they complement each other so well? What's actually happening for somebody who's suffering, who has a history that, you know, has that attachment shock or whatever? What's actually happening for them?
So what I think we're doing, what we're offering people with those histories with neurofeedback, is the experience of self-regulation. This is not small. This is huge. But what keeps disrupting that feeling of what disrupted it with that election for me, right? What disrupted it was what I've come to believe, and I'm pretty sure we're right about this, is that attachment shock. How could people do this? How could they leave the world open to such harm, to such catastrophe? How could they willingly make that vote? How could this happen? That kind of disbelief, that if you sit that question on top of it for a child who's had trauma, really pretty severe trauma and not much parenting, it really has a profound resonance, right? So what neurofeedback had done for me, and still can do and does for the vast majority of people with these histories, is to help them regulate affect. It mimics the process of a good enough mother. It gives the nervous system the experience of self-regulation, which is all nervous systems want. So maybe for many, I'm not sure about this, that's enough. If you reduce the reactivity, so the replay of the early trauma, then perhaps it's done. You don't need to go further. Okay. That's enough. It's so insignificant. If there's any trill of horror, it's just subsumed and taken care of. And you go about, you go and, I don't know, you take a long walk, you take a hike, or you do something to regulate, you self-regulate, and you're fine, and you go on, right? But for certain brains, under certain assaults from certain histories, that might not be sufficient. And I think those are the brains we're talking about with DBR. And the hypothesis is, with Frank's hypothesis, is that shock continues to vibrate. It's vibrate in the central, in the brainstem. And the brainstem, not the amygdala, the brainstem drives the fear response in the human system. So this is a big deal. My book on developmental trauma and neurofeedback is coming out again, was being reissued in April as a paperback, and they asked me to write a new preface. And in the new preface, I could write about anything. I wrote about two central things. One was, well, I wrote about emerging research about the mother who turns away and the baby who keeps trying. This is very important research. I wrote about shock, and I wrote about the amygdala. So I said, okay, so you're reading my book that I wrote 10 years ago, published 10 years ago, means I wrote it 12 years ago. It's got the amygdala, right? Every place it's got the amygdala, strike it, and write in your own head, write brainstem, okay? And then in my original book, I had said, in the book, that I had said, every therapy had to have an attachment orientation, but I didn't have a preference for therapy. I now have a preference for therapy, and that would be DBR. So, and it's a very particular therapy. It's too much to go into, but it's a very well-developed therapy, and it would look like the experimental data coming out, the data on research data coming out on DBR is pretty impressive. And so the clinical data is already out and impressive, and then they're looking at changes in the brain, and we'll see what that looks like on fMRI. So affect regulation is the job of neurofeedback, in my view, and helping the brain release this vibration of shock that's holding it captive at whatever level it is. It's a very deep level, or was probably a fairly deep level and very foundational level, because that's what drives the fear response, fear, shame, rage response in the human brain. So I think that's why we need both, and they work together.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much for having this conversation today, Sebern.
I love conversations with you, Lars.
Awesome.
It's my pleasure. It's my
That's great. And
okay.
are there any last thoughts, things that you would like for folks to know, for therapists and clinicians to really know going forward?
Well, I think I think one of the things, and this is not this is not meant as a plug, but it's meant as information, that I think that I think that neurofeedback trauma therapists who are using neurofeedback will want, like me, to learn about DBR. And the place where I would send people to do, well, anyway, they can get a course with Frank Corrigan, which is very hard to come by, but to know, because the demand for him is huge. And but that to come through EEGer to try to get training in this, because it's an ongoing conversation between people who work with trauma, who work with neurofeedback, and learn DBR, that we're going to understand how to focus this treatment in a way that becomes available, useful, and documentable, so so we can research it, really. And it's going to be through people who have already learned neurofeedback, where I think we're going to get the most data, the most information. So anyway, I do appreciate your bringing Frank Corrigan to the neurofeedback community, and let people who are neurofeedback people who are listening to this and have reason to know that they need to learn this therapy, and they need to remember the arousal model. And those are the two things that I leave you with.
That's great. Thank you. See you around.
You're so welcome.
Thanks for watching. If you found something helpful, use a like and subscribe. It helps us with YouTube algorithm and lets us know we're on the right track.